All right, so I want to set the stage for really what we're going to try and do in this workshop. And there's certain ethical dilemmas that I want to address. And I'm certainly not the first person to point this out, that new technologies confront us with new ethical dilemmas, but I want to deal with specific ones, yeah? So I wanted to take a couple of examples where the use of online social networking sites blurs between our political interests, our personal interest. In some way, the information that is posted on this site is taken and used for something else, not for what it was intended to be used for, right? So we have researchers right now that are looking at how you can learn more about the users on Twitter by following their actual posts. So now you can actually determine through the content of what people say, what their gender is, and also what their age is. And now researchers are looking at, can we combine these two, but can we also add something like gestures or smiles to learn even more about the individuals? So certainly, when you're posting tweets, that's not really what you're thinking of, that someone out there is trying to figure out what your gender is, what your age is, and then maybe use it for some other purpose, right? Or we have, stories like the one at the top where individuals are engaging in an activity online, and this activity, this like, something as simple as a like, has repercussions in their real world, in their non-virtual realities, yeah? So there was an example in Scotland where an individual clicked like and he was fired because the like was a comment that was derogatory towards his boss. Or this individual here, he believes that his boss found out that he was homosexual because he clicked like on a photo of a same-sex couple who were getting married, and he believes that he was fired because of this, yeah? And this was the Scotland story that I was talking about. So this idea that information that we are posting in a, air quotations, private sphere of our lives is being used in another sphere of our lives. Or if we take this even a step further, I would assume that I don't have to introduce the NSA or the NSA scandals to you all, but the idea that now government organizations want to use information that we're posting on social networking sites for their own purposes, whether or not that's getting a more well-rounded picture of the citizen or understanding their behaviors and their habits in a different way. And this was, of course, really popular a couple years ago with Snowden releasing what the NSA was actually doing. And the discourse after this inspired the image of a balance, right? A balance between security of the state and individual privacy. That in order to achieve this ideal of a secure state, you're going to have to balance this with your individual privacy. You're going to have to give up individual privacy. So I want to spend some time talking about this idea of balancing, because we should all understand that when you balance something, when you say that you're going to implement a security measure and you will minimize privacy in a certain setting, to balance that means you have to implement additional measures to realign privacy with security. Otherwise, what we're really talking about is not a balance at all, it's a trade-off. You're saying you're giving up privacy in order for the security of the state, yeah? So what are the ethical issues when talking about these contemporary examples? There's a variety of them. There's this concept of identity management. How does an individual have control over what information they share, how it's shared, when it's shared? Do they have the opportunity to correct it once it's been shared or before it actually is shared? But also this idea of taking information from a certain site where it's been intentionally put on that site and using it in another way, which is not intended by the user, and oftentimes not even known by the user that that's a possibility or an option, right? So the question then is, are we allowed to do this? Right? If you are engaging in posting tweets and you know that Twitter is a public domain, right? All tweets are stored in the National Congressional Library. There is no reasonable expectation to privacy in this forum. But does that mean that you can take this information and use it for something else when you didn't give consent and you had no idea that it was going to be used there? Right? And who should be allowed to take this information? Do you think there's a difference between an advertising company? They're certainly not going to be stalking you or using it for the same purposes as the government, maybe to detect fraudulent behavior. They just want to know more about you so that they can send you advertisements for books and for clothes, and there's a sale on at this store. Is that okay? Is there one instance when it's okay and one instance when it's not? What are the limits here, right? Who would be allowed to take this information if we say that that's allowed. Right, so what are the limits? This idea of data minimization, is this a new idea, or is this something common for everyone? The idea that you only take the minimal amount of data. So let's say I'm a researcher and I want to learn about certain patterns of an individual, and there's a ton of data available on Facebook that I could use, or a ton of data available on Twitter, but I only take that data which is necessary for me to answer my research question. This is the idea of data minimization, and it's a huge problem because oftentimes researchers have all of this data and they say, well, I may as well take it all because I might use it at some point. It could be necessary. I could find all of these correlations. Data mining, right? And then this idea, again, like I mentioned before, the distinction between a value trade-off and balancing of values. This is really important in the ethics domain, to understand the distinction between these two, so that we understand when we hear information in the media about, well, you're just balancing between the two values. Is it really a balance, or are we actually giving up a certain level of privacy, or giving up a certain conception of privacy in order to allow the government or advertising agencies to collect at will? So these are some of the issues that I want to touch on, but mostly what I really want to get at is the meaning of privacy in certain online contexts and how it differs from one context to another. So privacy in the Twitter environment has a different meaning from privacy in the Facebook environment, for example. Right, in Facebook you can choose your friends, so you can post things to the public, but the majority of time it's your 800 and however many friends, right? Your close friends that you're deciding to share your information with. So this does give you a difference, right? A different picture. There's an intuition that is different here, that I'm choosing to share a certain amount of information with these people that are in my circle. And then on top of this conversation of privacy, because it's very important, of course, what other values come into play? So I mentioned this idea of a balancing act or a trade-off between privacy and security. But what other values do we need to discuss when we talk about taking information from an online social networking site and using it somewhere else? Fairness, right? Is this fair? Is this a just practice? Or accuracy, accountability. Who is accountable? Can we go and complain to someone if we find out what Google is doing or what Facebook is doing? Are we allowed to complain about this? They might redirect us to the terms of use that we all clicked the box and said, yes, use my information. But is there some place, someone, some entity that can be accountable for the mistakes that are made? So, part one, the problem and the solution. Is anyone here unfamiliar with the T3 project, the Facebook project, the Taste, Ties, and Time? No, you're not familiar? Okay, so back when Facebook just started, so at the beginning of the century, early 2000s, they were obviously collecting information, as they are today, yeah, but they collected information on a certain cohort, on a certain group of students, and they saved this information. And 4 years after the start, after this group of students had started and finished their program, so 4 years later, so you've left university, you're not hanging out with the same people maybe, or you're in your career, whatnot, they released information about this whole group of students. They de-anonymized, or they anonymized this information, so they didn't release names or information like that, but they released enough details about persons and the courses that they were taking, or their age, or their gender, that you could actually de-anonymize them. So the intention was that this data could be incredibly useful for sociologists to run experiments, to make correlations between students and likes and dislikes, and so they posted it online. This was freely available, and they found out within hours. They hadn't released what university the students were at, but they released enough information that within hours, researchers started to write and say, this is a study group from Harvard, and this is the year that they were students. within hours. So then Facebook is thinking like, oh crap, what are we gonna do? They retract the data, but people had still, you know, saved it, so they continued to try and de-anonymize. And within 24 hours, a lot more information was revealed about these individuals. So much so that there was one student from Iran who was actually posting things that had to do with his sexuality, which were problematic for his culture. So then there was issues of discrimination that came into play. So this is the Facebook T3 project, right? And of course, this is just one example of the practices of Facebook. You've probably all heard of recently where Facebook manipulated like 800,000 news feeds. They put either positive or negative messages, right? So they can manipulate your information, but this experiment is noteworthy because people, you know, society started to think, oh geez, what we're putting on Facebook, even though we think that it's private, Facebook can do with it what they want, and it's possible to learn a lot about us as individuals. So then people started to say, okay, didn't you guys go through an institutional review board or an ethics review board? And they did. The ethics review board, the institutional review board of Harvard, said that this was okay. So the conclusion from this and all of the problematic situations that happened afterwards was that we have to have more ethics review boards, and they have to be more sort of integrated with the researchers, and they have to be more up to date with what the technology is actually capable of doing. So this was the proposed solution, yeah? But, oops, now we get to this situation where ethics review boards are suffering from fatigue, right? A lot of the times you're a volunteer to be on this review board. So I'm on the computer science, electrical engineering, and mathematics review board at my university in Twente. And all of these professors, you know, are juggling between all of the lectures and the papers and the grants and the this and the that. And then at some point, you have to find a time when all of us can get together and meet so that we can review all of these research proposals and say yes or no. It's really quite exhausting, first of all, but complicated and difficult to get everyone together. And it's a volunteer basis. You certainly can't pay people to be on the ethics committee because that sort of, you know, makes things a little bit sketchy, yeah? Not only that, but these review boards have a very distinct image for researchers. They're seen as disruptive. In many universities, people just think, oh, it's going to take so much time if I have to go to the review board, and I need to start with my experiments. I need to be interviewing people or sending out my questionnaires next week, and the review board is going to take me an additional 4 weeks or 5 weeks. I don't have the time. This is just, you know, not going to work for me. Or they're seen, so this idea of disruptive, time-consuming, unhelpful. So a lot of times you might get feedback from the ethics review board that just says, nope, you are breaching privacy or you're breaching security in this instance, and that's sort of where it ends, because the review board doesn't have time to go into all of the details and how you might be able to fix it. And this idea that the review board is somewhat useless. And of course, I'm not presenting everyone's views on review boards, but these are some of the strands of thoughts that are common or popular right now, which then minimizes people's willingness to put their research through the review boards, especially if you, in the UK, you have to go through the review board to do research, but in the Netherlands, it's a very different context. It's voluntary right now for the moment. So this solution isn't turning out to be so much of a solution. So now what? Well, when you think of European grant proposals, you have this sort of ethics checklist, and you check the box whether or not you're going to be dealing with personally identifiable information. Are you using animals for your experiments? Is it possible that you could uncover medical information about the patient? So you click, you know, yes or no, and this accomplishes your ethics portion. So for all of you who know the reflexivity that's required for ethics, you have to ask whether or not you can reduce ethics to a checklist, right? It's about much more than just yes, no, yes. It's this consideration of, wait, what am I doing? And what are the consequences, the unintended consequences, the users versus the non-users and the unintended users? This kind of reflection needs to take place, and it can't happen when you actually are doing ethics, or ethics is summed up by a checklist. So then now what? So another potential solution, one that I'm advocating in favor of, is this idea of an ethics advisor. And the ethics advisor is an individual who's trained in ethics to work alongside the researchers. So you become sort of a member of the design team. You have a stake in the research that's happening. This individual is able to identify the ethical issues in the dilemma, so it goes well beyond whether or not you're going to be using animals for experimentation or whether or not you could have information revealed about individuals, of a medical nature. It goes well beyond that, the relationship between technology and values, that kind of thing. But also, the second point, it allows for space of less transparency. And you might be thinking, oh, what are you talking about, less transparency? That can't be good. But sometimes researchers need to talk to someone about their unclarity or what they might be afraid and worried of without having someone say, no, you can't do that, that's wrong, that's just bad. They need to understand what it is that they're trying to do and what the potential problems could be. So the ethics advisor, is a counselor of sorts, comes to talk about them and to hear about the research and to work with them to try and achieve their goals, but maybe using a different technological platform or design method. This idea of the role of the ethicist is not necessarily to be prescriptive, to say you can't do it or you can do it, but to empower, to encourage a reflection on the work of the engineer or the computer scientist, and to allow that individual to come to a decision about, yes, no, I feel comfortable with what I'm doing, or I think I should probably change some of the points of my research. So the role of the ethicist isn't the person to come and shake their finger, but is more of a tool. Is more of a supportive role to empower the researchers to come to grounds with their decisions. At the same time, the ethics advisor still may be in situations where they do have to be prescriptive and to say, you really shouldn't be doing this. There are way too many severe consequences that you have to take into consideration. So as a disclaimer, of course, there are other solutions that are offered, some technical solutions. The PRIME project, one of the researchers at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, Ronald Leens, is trying to create a software program for identity management so that your computer sort of gives you a warning when you're going to do your online banking or when you're paying with credit card, just to sort of flag, do you know exactly where this information is going, where it is stored, etc. In the bioethics sphere, there's an author right now who's talking about the idea of crowdsourcing to gain more ethics insight, so having everyone sort of give their opinion as a way of engaging in ethical review. And then many researchers right now are talking about the education of engineers, that we need to start when they're in university or even before they get to university about what ethics means and how there are, of course, these different theories, these different normative theories and approaches to ethics, but that it's a discussion, a reflexivity, a capability, right? A practical wisdom, and that these engineers should be encouraged to develop these ethical skills. So those are other solutions, but of course the solution that I'm going to talk about today is my preferred one, which is this idea of the ethics advisor who's hands-on. And an important part to remember is that it maintains a human in the loop. So a lot of times, I was giving a talk at a summer school on identity management, and they were talking about these assistive tools, where you can type in the technology and you can type in what company, what building, whatnot that you're using, and then this software goes through and assesses whether or not there's going to be problems. And what I found to be remarkable was that the ethics was delegated to a software program, and that really, when we're talking about something like ethics, it's incredibly important to maintain the human in the loop. Not necessarily because the human ethicist has to be responsible for the consequences, but there's so much more that can be gained by having a conversation, making eye contact, allowing you to ask me a question, allowing you to respond to what it is that I've just told, rather than all of that fading to the background and you're plugging in the risk assessment information. So the idea of the ethics advisor is very important to keep the human in the loop, and then all of the other things that I had said before, the space for less transparency, etc. So what is the ethics advisor? What was it that I was doing? I should probably say that, so right now I'm assistant professor in ethics of technology at the University of Twente, but for the last 2 years I was working as an ethics advisor for one of the technical institutes at this university, the Center for Telematics and Information Technology. And so my role was different from the ethics committee. I was on the ethics committee. But my role as ethics advisor was different. I was wearing a different hat, if you will. So I would go meet with individuals one-on-one and talk to them about their research and problems that they might have. I would go to a research group and give a colloquium, so in the same way that we're sort of doing this now, but of course I would talk about what is ethics? Ethics is about the good life, and what are the 3 normative theories, so that they had an understanding of what we were talking about in the ethics domain. Yeah? So there's this, education for groups, there's an education sort of one-on-one, but really the idea was that I was working alongside these individuals. So I wasn't something that was separate like the ethics committee. I came and visited them, once a week, and we talked about things. I gave them reading material, they gave me reading material. We were working in conjunction with each other. It was a very pragmatic ethics. So I'm not sure if you've done pragmatism. But this idea of learning by doing, of the method of inquiry, so understanding the situation before you can even reveal whether or not there is an ethical problem. That was the sort of method that I was engaged in. The type of ethics that I dealt with then, I didn't commit myself to a deontological approach. I didn't go in and say, what is your duty as a computer scientist or a computer engineer? Because of course they would come back with the Data Protection Act, but then how do you translate that into design requirements? Sometimes most of the time that isn't very clear. I also wasn't committed to a consequentialist approach. What are the consequences of using this product out in the real world? Sometimes that didn't really get us far, because individuals would say, I'm not responsible for what happens when it goes out into the real world. I'm just doing the fundamental research right now to help whatever company wants to buy it. So then the communication breaks down when they don't see any link with responsibility. I wasn't committed to virtue ethics, but I was constantly trying to get them to reflect on what their role as a computer scientist or a computer engineer was about. What did this image of the good engineer look like? How did they act? How did they reflect on things? So if I had to say that I was committed to one approach, I would say virtue ethics was always sort of in the background, but that wasn't necessarily how I was evaluating anyone's decisions. What I was doing really was value analysis. So are you familiar with value-sensitive design, or the idea of the embedded values concept? No? Okay. So the embedded values concept is simply that there are values embedded in a technology, so that when you use the technology, the consequences of using it realize a value in the real world. Yeah? So if we take something that you wouldn't even consider a technology, imagine you're in the hospital and you have the curtain, that goes around the patient's bed. The action of enclosing the curtain around the patient's bed brings privacy into reality. Using the curtain, the interaction between the human and the curtain realizes privacy. Now, if we take this into a technical sphere, you can consider something like the company Silent Circle, and they create the ability for individuals to have private phone calls. So using VoIP technology, you get a sort of a calling card, and you're able to have phone calls that are untraced and therefore cannot be tracked and are not stored in any sense of the word. So if you're in a country where you're a journalist and maybe you're worried about your safety there, this is an incredible technology, so that when you use it, you are essentially having a private conversation. The consequences of using this technology are privacy. Or if you're in an abusive relationship and you don't want your spouse to be able to have any access to phone records, this technology then allows for your protection, your privacy. So the idea there is that values and technology are very strongly linked. This is the embedded values concept. Now, value-sensitive design comes in and says, if we agree to that and we take that as our starting point, that this relationship exists, then why not intentionally design technologies in a way, a systematic way, that they always embed the values that we want them to, and that we're very clear about understanding trade-offs and balances, and we do this through the design process. So instead of at the end being, oh, OMG, what have I done? I've created this technology that is, terrible when it comes to maintaining privacy of individuals, or now reflecting back on Facebook, right? What does privacy even mean here? So value-sensitive design scholars are saying, Let's try and leave that paradigm and now start at the beginning of the design process and create technologies in a way that encourages the promotion of values. So this is the approach that I was trying to do with these computer scientists and engineers, to get them to talk about what is your intention here. And if I'm working in the internet security group, they're always saying, well, I'm protecting security. We are trying to blacklist anyone that's been caught delivering spam messages. And then they don't even think about the potential consequences or the other values that come into consideration. They wouldn't think that by blacklisting without having a justification or a clarification on who that IP address was actually linked to, that they had the potential to mislabel malicious users in the way that they were actually doing this blacklisting. And so the idea of justice, right? Where does justice or fairness come in? That these individuals that might have been taken over, so you can hijack a system or an IP address. This happens many, many times. And if your computer is taken over, you could be blacklisted without having any idea of what's going on, that your computer is sending out a whole bunch of spam messages, right? So even though you're promoting this ideal of internet security, what have you forgotten to look at? And is there any way that you can look at it and maybe change certain design requirements so that you can address justice or fairness throughout your research? So that's the kind of work that I was doing as ethics advisor. I'll skip through this, but it's just sort of, in a paper I go into much more detail about this idea of the ethicist as designer, and that there are very specific tasks that I was engaged in. But it's pretty much what I was pointing at right there. Now the scope of the work, so how in-depth I can actually go, is dependent on a variety of things. The stage of the research, so if we're at the very beginning of the research project, you can have a lot more influence, if you will. You can help think along with the engineers, and then you have the potential to change some of their choices, or to help them change some of their choices. If they come to you after the data's been collected, after it's been shared, after all of these problems have happened, really your role is just to help reflect on what they did wrong, or what they should have taken into consideration. At that point, you can't really make any changes on their research. But that doesn't, I don't want to minimize working with individuals that come to you at this later stage of development, because these individuals will continue to do research and to collect data. So you still want to have an impact and to have them reflect on their decisions, because then they will do that in their future professional roles. The context of the research. So the case studies that I'll be talking about are all in an academic setting. And this is important because there's one value that doesn't get prioritized above all of the other values. That's the economic value, yeah? When you're in an industrial setting, you might be trying to consider, okay, how do we protect people's privacy? How do we maintain security? And then you have, the corporate interest coming in and say, well, we're gonna have to trade those off because, we have shareholders, we have stakeholders that want us to be making money. And so we're gonna have to make money in whatever way we see fit. So I leave that discussion to the side, and right now we just talk about this academic setting so that we can really have a different understanding of coming to terms with the values at stake. So we're going to talk now about this framework, right, that I've been leading up to for incorporating ethics into research and design practices. So what I want to distinguish first between are, sorry, I'm going to have a mint, two different ethical dimensions here. So there's the ethics of the computer scientist and what they're doing. This is one dimension. How do we evaluate that in terms of what's good and bad, right or wrong? And the other dimension is the ethics of the ethicist. So me as an ethics advisor, how did I evaluate what I was doing? Right? So there were certain instances where I was more prescriptive, and I said, the severity of the ethical consequences here mean that you have to change what you're doing. And how do I know that that was the right thing to do, or the good thing to do? That's an entirely different dimension from looking at the ethics of the computer scientist. So today, I want to just focus on the first dimension. But if you're interested in the second dimension, which is a very hot topic in the ethics world right now, I've just written something about that, but we can also discuss on a break, or I guess after we're done talking, if you want more information. So, to bring some of the different ideas together, what's incredibly important is that we must recognize this contextual nature of privacy. So this is what I was talking about at the very beginning, before getting into the role of the ethics advisor. And on the next slide, I'll give a little bit more context to that. But just this idea of privacy has very different meanings in these different online contexts. And Twitter and Facebook is a really good example to make that tangible, to make that very clear. That when you are posting tweets, you have a different mentality than when you are posting a photo of you and your boyfriend or girlfriend on Facebook. That photo isn't necessarily for the whole world to see, but a tweet is something that is intended for, well, the whole world, or whoever is following you, right, on Twitter. Another insight with an intention to protect people's privacy, this idea of controlling the flow of information, data minimization is a must. So it becomes a duty, a responsibility, an obligation of engineers to only collect the data that they require for their research question or for their research purposes. Yeah? So this idea of data minimization. Consent. Of course, this is incredibly important in the medical domain, but is also, according to the Data Protection Act, is also incredibly important when we're talking about taking data from these online social networking sites. Yeah? But how do you get consent? And you'll see that in some instances, in order to get consent of the individual, you have to break their privacy, which is fascinating because there are certain times where you have data of persons, and you could find out the IP address, or you could find out who that individual is, but in order to do that, you're going to have to send the information to a third party that will put things together, and then the putting things together, you could then contact the person and say, can I use your data to run this experiment that I want to actually do? Whereas if you hadn't sent any of that to the third party, you wouldn't necessarily know who the individual was. You would just have enough bits or pieces of that individual in order to answer your question. So asking for consent is incredibly relevant, but you also have to take into consideration what asking for consent really means. And now this idea that research should be done on a case-by-case basis is really gaining sway these days. So the fact that technologies are constantly changing and are changing so quickly. I mean, cloud computing, the future of the internet has just sort of thrown everything off its course again. So is it possible then to have laws to establish how people should be acting? Is it possible that we stick with duties, or do we have to be more flexible? Do we have to do this on a case-by-case basis and understand what does this method of data collection mean for this context? For this time period, stored in this way and disseminated or shared in this way, versus what does the same method of collection mean in a different context, stored for a different amount of time and disseminated in a different way. Yeah, there's different ethical implications, even just changing one variable. So it's important to understand that it's not easy to make universal rules or duties. We have to do this on a case-by-case basis. So a word on privacy, which I think I can go quickly through because I imagine this is common discourse for you all, but how privacy, this concept of privacy has changed over different eras. So if we think about the printing press era, yeah, individual thoughts didn't need to be shared. Yeah, and the same for prior to the printing press era, when it was just verbal. If you didn't want to share a thought, there wasn't the necessity to share it. Yeah, so there was this very clear concept of the private sphere being, in your mind, in your head, and then you had the opportunity to share it at will if you wanted. Then, when we shift into the area of mass media, this idea of the right to be left alone came into play. And so this was a response to certain movie stars had their pictures published without their consent and didn't want those certain pictures published. You probably all know these stories anyway, but they didn't want these pictures published, and so this idea of the right to be left alone started to become a part of the discourse at this time. Then, once we move into the era of databases, this is again before we have the internet, before we have that kind of interconnectivity, there was still the idea that governments could collect copious amounts of information on you and store them in one place, but they had a very well-rounded picture of the citizen. And what did they need this for? Yeah, that was of course the question. But the idea of privacy was not necessarily this idea of wanting to be left alone at this point. Now we shift into a discussion about having control over information about oneself. Yeah? That you want to control when it's published, how it's published, and to what extent the information is communicated or published, but also stored. So not even this idea of privacy relating to whether or not it's going out or being stored in a governmental database, but really the fact that it's being collected at all sort of minimized our ability to have control over information about ourselves. Now we move into the area to the era of smart environments, right? Where we have the internet that just changes everything, yeah? You have artificial bots on the internet that are creeping and gathering as much information about you as possible. So it's not even now individuals trying to bring together data on you. The human agent has been taken out of the equation in many instances. But now privacy is shown to have this link with identity, and both are emerging within a particular context. So now the discussion on privacy is shifting from one about, I want to have control over my information, or I want to be left alone. Privacy isn't really focused, or the concept of privacy is shifting focus now to look at what it means to create an identity with all of this information online. So some ethicists are talking about the idea of people being reduced to numbers or being reduced to the geolocation. You can see that I have a regular travel pattern of going from my house to the university, and then I take the train to go here and there, and So my identity is expressed through this kind of data in the online medium, in the online world. Or it's expressed by how many likes in a day I click, or the kinds of things that I'm liking, or the content that I'm posting on Twitter, or the content that I'm posting on Facebook. So now privacy isn't necessarily seen anymore about control, but it's about the relationship that it's sharing with our identity, because it's in the best interest of the government, of marketing, advertising, of companies to create an identity for you based on your online movements. So part of the discussion then has to do with I don't necessarily like the fact that Amazon sends me notices about this really great book that I would love because I bought one self-help book or something, That's not true, even though there's nothing wrong with that, right? But, that is just a very small part of my life. That's not my identity. I'm not an individual who is constantly looking for that kind of material. So do you see what I'm getting at here? Now this link with the creation of our identities, and also this being a nominal thing. And so for the ethics scholars, moral identity is not something that can be reduced to numbers. So how do we balance between this idea of Amazon and Google and Facebook? They have identified me as a certain kind of individual, but I have a narrative, I have a story. I posted that angry message that one day because, it was a certain time of the, you know where I was going with that. So there's this struggle here, right? And when you're so engrossed in this online world, is it possible anymore to step out and see what your identity is outside of this context? Anyway, so the discussion about privacy brings us to Helen Niesenbaum, who is in the United States of America, a computer ethicist, a computer scientist, who talks about the contextual nature of privacy. And now, to introduce it, there are some flaws in the framework that she tries to present, because she says that in order to evaluate privacy in a context, we should first look at what the norms are of that context. What are normal sharing practices for that context? And you can use different environments to compare between. And then you have the problem with a sort of naturalistic fallacy, right? Just because that is the norm doesn't necessarily mean that that's right or the good thing, yeah? So I'm not saying that we should take up Nissenbaum's entire framework, but what she does point out is this very poignant idea of the contextual nature of privacy, that it's important to look from one online context to another and to understand what it means, and to evaluate that as well. To say, you know, privacy is different between Facebook and Twitter, but maybe it shouldn't be. You know, maybe tweets shouldn't be stored in the National Congressional Library. Maybe that's something that doesn't actually need to happen. Who is that benefiting? So that we have the record for dating practices. We can see what our future spouses were tweeting 10 years ago. Maybe we want to know that. Yes, yeah, sorry. Okay, I shouldn't have said that with such a negative undertone. Maybe we want to know that information.